Well, hello and welcome to the Reconstructionist podcast, where we help you reconstruct while you deconstruct so you don't self-destruct. So this week we have an old guest on, not in age, but in the time that period from when we last had him, because he was right at the beginning of this podcast. He helped launch it. He was super gracious because we didn't have a podcast, we didn't have anything to show him, and he said yes to being on it. And so super grateful to him for that. And his name is Joshua Leventhal, and he is a music artist, a worship artist that makes really interesting music, really thoughtful music that I love. He is someone who writes what I would call worship music that isn't kind of K-lovey and isn't the kind of stuff you'll probably hear on a Sunday, where it's music that is worshipful, but is willing to sit with themes that are themes that Christian music often doesn't deal with, whether it's suffering, pain, loss, that he's willing to actually just sit and rest in those themes. And he has a new album that just released called All Ye Lepers, and we kind of dive into some of my favorite tracks from that album. We discuss what inspired them, what brought those out of him. And so I'm super excited for you to hear from him. And so without further ado, here's Joshua Leventhal. Well, okay, Joshua, how are you doing?
Good, man. Good. It's a Monday.
But, yeah, it's a Monday. It's a Monday for us. You haven't been on this podcast in a long time, because I think we would have recorded it like the episode we did with you, because it was right at the beginning, which was awesome because you were super generous. Because at the time we recorded it, I had nothing to even show you, and you're like, "Sure, I'll be on your podcast. It doesn't exist yet." And I was like, "That's great." And that was also like in the midst of like peak COVID times, so it's been a while.
That would have been like what, 2021, I think, a couple years ago.
Yeah, something like that. And so I'm pumped to chat with you again about music, especially. But there's probably a bunch of people who don't know who you are.
Sure.
So could you just give like the rundown of who you are, what you do, and what you've been up to lately?
Yeah, so my name is Joshua Leventhal. I am a singer-songwriter, recording artist, worship leader. I work on staff at a local church here in Chilliwack, BC. Have been releasing music under my own name since 2017, with a bit of a few-year hiatus in there as well. But yeah, have been writing both for the church, and I think my music used to kind of toe the line a little bit more between it could be congregational, could be more reflective. And I've started to go down the lane of allowing it to just be more on the reflective side, not trying to make it fit congregational. And then I write like explicitly congregational music on the other side, very, very distinctly. And so I've started to kind of not walk the tension quite as much and more separate my lanes.
Well, and I really appreciate you as an artist because, like you said, like you've kind of moved into the more reflective, but I still find, because it's not something you'd hear someone play on a Sunday, for example.
Yeah.
But I still find music like that super helpful for like my personal life, because I, as a musician, got really bored of worship music. And so I really like worship music that's worshipful, but isn't necessarily, I don't know, like the 3-chord, whatever that you'd expect. It's super easy to follow along, what you have to do, because people have to be able to learn the song in like 2 seconds. And so it's like, it has to be simple because people need to be able to sing this and figure it out. But I appreciate the work you do because you do both. And I really love the stuff you do. And I really love this album, actually. And I kind of want to dive right into it with a couple tracks that I just highlighted in the time that we had that I personally want to hear about from you. And so the first song, because this was one of the singles that came out, and I remember hearing this being like, man, this song is so good, and it's called The Gallows. And it's, man, so your lyrics I always really appreciate, because it's obvious that a lot of thought goes into it, because it's not just like, I don't know, the typical, you could kind of follow this pattern and you've kind of heard something like this before. Like you really find a unique way to express like just ideas and emotions. And a lyric I really like from that song is, you say you've paid all my debt, but I'm still living like the rent is due, which I think is just super interesting lyric. And so the song's really about like wrestling through kind of what Jesus has done, and then also wrestling with yourself and realizing that, hey, I don't always live like the reality I'm in. And so I was just wondering, for you, as you wrote this song, what kind of inspired this song for you personally?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the kind words. I like to approach things when Jordan Peele made Get Out, he said, I wanted to make a movie I hadn't seen before. And I think that's kind of my approach for songwriting too. I want to write things that I haven't necessarily heard before. I can't tell how obvious my influences are. They're pretty eclectic. So, but yeah, I think with most things, I always say like a song starts with an idea, and that can be a lyrical idea, that can be a more general concept, that can be like a very explicit line, that can be a musical notion. And then you just kind of tug at that thread and see where it leads. And so with this one, it did start actually not with kind of the central chorus hook of like the notion of the gallows. It started with the very first line of the song, which is the I've been mixing my metaphors when it comes to you, and then going on to speak to some of those metaphors. And I think essentially I love the richness of how we can speak to like these kind of word paintings of who we are in Jesus. And as I started putting those together, naturally, just rhyme scheme wise, it went acquitted and the accused. And I'm like, but that's not the order we're in. We're accused and then we're acquitted in Jesus. And then so that led to, and I know those last two are the other way around because I'm no longer lost, but I forget that I'm found. You paid all my debt and I still live like the rent is due. And I realized that this was going to be the idea of mixed metaphors is almost a vehicle for the dissonance we can feel in the now and not yet of we've been fully atoned. We have access to all the freedom in Jesus, and yet it is often so hard to live in that reality. And so much of the New Testament are the writers basically saying, this is who you are, this is what you are, now do it, live like it. And they have to constantly drive that home because of how hard it is. And so that was kind of the space under which the kind of the question came, like the problem. And then the chorus just was an answer to that, just cut through all of that as simply as possible, and take all the complexity out of it. And it's like, you did this, so I wouldn't have to experience, like in graphic terms, execution. And then the bridge building off of that, basically going, but also there's a whole side of Christianity that basically just treats it like a life jacket, and that's all it is. When in fact there's so much more to it than that, and that we are not just saved from, we're saved to. And so allowing that to be the place that we get to, and it weaves in, right? Like eventually the chorus and the bridge start to mix together so that you have both those notions. It's like, you saved me from this and you saved me to this. And that's where it ultimately lands. And so it was just one of those tugging at the thread songs. And it's funny, actually, I'm trying to remember where I was at in terms of finishing it, but I ended up finishing it like days before pre-production, like to the point where
Really?
I didn't actually have I didn't even have like a reference track for my producer. Like when I went out to the island to work on it with him, like I just basically like,
Wow.
I got this song I'm really excited about. I'll just show you when I'm there. And then, and there were actually two like that. And they ended up being two of my favorites on the record. But yeah, they were just like finished really, really quickly. Originally, actually the chorus for the song, I was trying to kind of get the bridge and the chorus idea into just the chorus. And it was very different. It was almost like Springsteen-y. It was very weird. Like very like backbeat, like power anthem, like all, like it was almost like a Born in the USA. It's as weird as that sounds. And then it wasn't working. It felt too cluttered and stuff. And so there's just this switch of cleaning it out to making it as simple as possible, and then also fitting the vibe of like the rest of it much better, I think.
Yeah.
Of the verse, and then moving that into the bridge, those notions into the bridge, which then kind of gave a lot more space.
But you hung on that tree to keep me from the gallows. Yeah, you hung on that tree to keep me from the gallows.
That's awesome. Yeah, the Bible Project has like free classes that you can take, and I've been doing one on First Corinthians, and I find it so interesting, just like because we often, because we're so far from the early church that sometimes we have like these rose-colored glasses of
Yeah.
what was happening. We're like, oh, it was so awesome. And if only we could be like the early church. But when you read like a book like First Corinthians, you're like, man, these people are a mess. Because the whole book is just Paul being like, hey, remember you guys are Christians. Can
Yeah.
you stop acting like you're not Christians, please?
Yeah.
And
He's
so,
he's like there's stuff that pagans wouldn't do that
yeah,
y'all are
this
doing.
stuff,
It's
yeah.
bad.
And
Totally.
so, yeah, I think that that's interesting. The whole like idea of, yeah, Christians have always struggled with this of like knowing what's true, but then actually living like it and sorting that out. And so I think that's super powerful. Another song on the record that I really love, and I think this song is actually my favorite of all of them, is "The Meantime." I just really love
That's
it. I love
probably my favorite
that.
too.
Yeah, I was looking at what was most popular, and I don't know how accurate Apple is at showing me that. And this one isn't at the top yet, and I'm like, it doesn't make any sense because I'm like, this song is incredible. And I just think it needs more advertising. But the whole song is like you're taking all these like biblical characters and people
Mhm.
and kind of reflecting on, because I even did a sermon about this just this week, about the inconvenience of like following God and sitting in that weird waiting period of like, it's easy when you read these stories in the Bible that you see like it happens so quickly, but
Yeah.
you forget about like the space in between of like, what is God doing? Like, so especially for someone like Abraham, when you think about it,
Yeah.
like that guy was like, hey, you're going to be made into this great nation. He never saw it happen. So it must
Yeah.
have been like this weirdest thing for this dude to sit through and just be like, his whole life, he never saw this promise fulfilled and just sitting in that. And so you play with that idea. And one of the good lyrics is the meantime's where I'm living now, and I confess I don't know how to wait. And I think, especially for me in my life, I think about that even in transitioning from my old church to the church I'm at, that like in between space of like, okay,
Yeah.
God, I feel like you're doing something, but I have no idea what. And what if I'm wrong? What if nothing happens? And I just find like, I don't know. So maybe that's why that song speaks to me deeply. But for
Sure.
you, well, you were writing this one. Well, you say it's one of your favorites, so I'd be curious why that is. But then also, like, what brought out playing with, I don't know, that whole idea? Because it's something that I don't even think I've heard a lot of people write about.
Hmm.
That I find, yeah, super interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is my favorite song on the record, and it is the other one that I finished like right before
So
pre-production.
weird.
Like it was like, and I can't remember what parts were like left, like that I still needed to do.
Mm,
But yeah, finished it right before, and so that one was at a deeply personal time.
mm,
Essentially, oh gosh, what have been like? It's like actually like the heartbreak coming out of it is from a breakup standpoint.
huh.
And so I was at the beginning of 2020. I had finally kind of come to this place where I had kind of taken a hiatus from dating and
Mm-hmm.
felt good about that, and then had felt very much like, okay, I've kind of come to this place where I think I'm at a point in life and in my heart where this is a good time to do that. And then within a few weeks of that, um, made a connection with somebody like literally right before the shutdown happened of the whole world.
Mm,
And it just felt like providence. Like it felt like, oh, this is like so clearly what I've been like waiting for.
yeah.
And then over the course of a few months, we dated in the midst of like kind of pandemic land where we were trying to figure out like how much we can see each other and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then it just like she just very abruptly and weirdly ended it. Um,
Mm,
and it was brutal. It was very confusing, and um, and I didn't understand at all. And I'd felt like I'd been doing all of this. I'd felt like basically a lifetime of waiting and um and formation and all these things had led to this, and then it just got
yeah.
dashed on the rocks. And so from there I very much felt like the two primary figures I speak about in the song, Joseph and Sarah. Joseph in the sense of
Mm,
like, dude is, I mean, he's cocky, but in terms of like how he conducts himself, he's living like purely and blamelessly, and does not get rewarded for it. Like, just keeps running into more and more upheaval and injustice as a result of it. And he gets to see the fruit of that payoff eventually, but it's this long process. And I've thought about him. My dad has talked about him a lot in my own life. He's kind of spoken that over it. And then Sarah, just kind of in terms of what you're saying, like, you know, we talk a lot about the Abraham side of things, but just to want to be a mother. And Sarah gets this bad laugh for laughing. When she's told that she's going to have a baby when she's like 90, I'm like, I think that's a pretty appropriate response.
Yeah.
And
I think I'd laugh.
Yeah. And I just the notion of being barren I just felt like pretty spent. And so I wrote, I'm trying to remember how much of I had written, a good chunk of it. And by the time I was going into pre-production, I had actually, like, you know, over well over a year later had met who is now my wife, and had a pretty good sense that she was going to be my wife. And so finishing the song in that space of coming out on the other side, but still needing it to, I kind of want people to feel like there's not a space that they can be in where these lyrics don't meet them. Like, that they can't sink to a place that's too low where, oh, that works for so-and-so, but it doesn't work for me. I want it to be no matter what level of grief you're experiencing, this acknowledges that grief and offers genuine hope, like not optimism, but hope. And so in the song, we get to a place that we actually talk about, like, you know, the fulfillment that both Joseph and Sarah experienced, but then it ends with Jesus in Gethsemane, and that side of death, that like that he still has to go through that and experience that before resurrection comes.
But the mean times where I'm living now, and I confess I don't know how to wait. You say it will be better than the little plans my fickle heart you make. But it's hard to give that reverence when I have no frame of reference for it. You're saying there's much hope in this, but right now hoping sure feels dangerous. Yeah, right now hoping sure feels dangerous. About Jesus in the garden at dusk, praying out his fears in drops of blood, begging for you to take the cup. But you didn't, so he obeyed till he took his last breath. But on a Sunday morning, showed us all what you intend to do with death.
Again, that idea, I think that's why the song lyrically hits. And I think you're right. I think it's one of those songs that you've written in a way that no matter where someone's at, it can be relatable. Because I think the Christian experience of sitting in that waiting is one that everybody experiences constantly, where once you like hit this point of being like, oh, I see the fulfillment of this, you're like now in a different waiting period of something else. And it always feels, and depending what it is, it can feel like hopeful, or you can feel super like, just like, God, I have no idea what's going on, depending on what it is. And so I think it's one of those songs that like will speak to a ton of people. And for me, hey, I'm glad it exists, because if I'm the only one who listens to it, I'm super pumped. I got a song I love.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, it's one of the more like Spotify gives me way more metrics than Apple does. And
Yeah,
it it is one of the more popular songs on the record.
there
But
you go. Good.
hasn't gotten quite the same love as a couple of them. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, hey, this will turn it around. Everyone's gonna go listen to it now. Another song on this record that I like a lot is Upholder. And in
Mm,
this record, you actually deal with like a lot of similar and like the feeling of like struggle, and but you
yeah.
tackle it in a bunch of different ways. So
Hmm.
it all sounds different, but it's really is just like there's a lot of talking about just the struggle of just trying to follow Jesus. And this one's really, I think, just about like the everyday life stuff and being like there's suffering and there's pain, and I know there's supposed to be a point to all this, but it doesn't feel like there's a point to it, and I don't get it. And one of the lyrics in there that I love is, "I'd like to think nothing happens in vain, but sometimes the silence starts swallowing faith." And I think that's really
Mm,
interesting. And I think that's putting into words what a lot of people do feel during that stuff
yeah.
is like, I want to have this hope, but the silence of like, God, what is going on makes me lose faith. Where I'm like, maybe I'm just believing in something that doesn't make sense. So for you, again, diving into your personal life, I guess, and letting us be a journal for you. What inspired that one for you? And even just in general for this record, why do you think there are so many songs in particular? Because I think it's different than your EP, if I'm remembering lyrically, where you had songs like this, but it feels like a lot of songs on this record really are diving more into like the struggle of being a follower of Jesus. But yeah, what inspired
Yeah.
that one for you?
Yeah. I think naturally I gravitate towards speaking around the nature of suffering in regard to the nature of the goodness of God. And I feel like the camps that end up happening a lot of the times out of that, there's kind of two ways it goes. Either people downplay and smooth over and are very happy go lucky, and then you get K-Love. You get like these Christian radio stations where they like just speak in these vague generalities about, yeah, it's hard, but the storm will pass. And like really you don't even need Jesus in there. Um and then on the other side, you have people who like actually go to the depths and then they leave. They just say, I can't reconcile these two things. And I love the idea of a better way where it's like, what if we go to the depths, but still from a place we don't have to betray hope or reverence? What if we explore those questions honestly, still from orthodoxy and still from a place of knowing who God is, but actually allowing. And I think that's like honestly what scripture gives us permission for. I think we fail to acknowledge that a lot of the time. That I mean, Chesterton has this wild passage about Gethsemane where he talks about how basically God in his full humanity in becoming Jesus experienced so much doubt and passed through what he calls the human horror of pessimism and doesn't break. He says at the end of the thing, like, atheists choose a God who became one for a minute, like who said, "You have forsaken me," um, and did so still knowing, like still with the and yet not my will but yours be done. So Jesus being the ultimate example of that, but the psalmist being constant, Job and Ecclesiastes. I mean, Ecclesiastes is probably about as pessimistic as it gets. Like I'm writing. Well, we can get to this later, but I'm writing a literal biblical epic. And there's a wisdom literature song that's like all five books kind of in one giant like 15-20 minute song. and and the Ecclesiastes one, like, basically he says like if you think you can live more life than I've lived and come to a different conclusion, trust me, I've already done it all. And it's brutal. And I think we are given much more permission to cry out than we give credit for a lot of the times. And so Upholder actually started, interestingly, some of my favorite lyrics have been ones that I actually didn't write. Like oftentimes I'll write music and lyrics at the same time. Like I kind of weave them together because I care about how they sing. But sometimes like I'll just start like basically writing poetry that's like it's inherently rhythmic, but doesn't have And I think basically that entire first chorus I wrote like while driving somewhere in the Okanagan. And it was like I was just like, coming up with stuff. And it's like when that happens, you either have to like speak it into your phone as quickly as possible into a voice memo, or like either like pull over and type it out. And I don't remember what like the inciting incident was that like led me to that, but I just liked the idea of calling it as it is in terms of all the things we can think about in terms of what is the relationship of both the goodness and the sovereignty of God, in relationship to pain, and not just mine, but like globally. I think as Christians, we're meant to, when we experience suffering, if that's not drawing us to the suffering of others and making us cry out at the injustice, like that's something that like it's going to naturally turn us inward, but it should also make our hearts break for other things. And so I was just like, I'm going to lay it on the table. Like, like when I say like, is this some cosmic spill? Because there are people who hold the theological position that basically, like, I think we can all agree God doesn't want suffering to happen. Well, maybe not everybody agrees with that, but most people would agree with that. But there are people who basically go like, God is like trying to make it not happen, and it's still happening. Like they kind of diminish his power and all that. And then there are other people who basically are like, yeah, that, they fall into either Job friend territory or just like uber sovereignty, where it's like he basically wants things to happen. And I just wanted to throw it all out there basically and leave it there. That one, I think Upholder and Through are pretty, they're in conversation with one another as songs. And Upholder is more of the questions, and Through is somewhat more of an answer. But like still ending in a place where it's like, I don't know how all this works, but I know that like you sustain it all. And that notion kind of came from, there's a book by Francis Spufford that like I have to cautiously recommend, because there's things in there I would definitely theologically disagree with for sure. But there are some really valuable things I think he says. And there's one passage where he like basically says, I can't help but acknowledge that like one way or another, like he's sustaining every molecule, including like the alley where somebody is being assaulted, and like, this like bathroom where a junkie's shooting up, like all of these, he's still upholding this world. And that doesn't mean he's causing all of that, but like he, like by nature of it, of him holding it all together, it's happening. And so trying to like leave space for, okay, this is, but then we don't stay there, right? Like, but not tying things up. I'm very big on not tying things up with a pretty little bow and like letting things sit in some tension.
How much peace should I long for while still in this life? It's clear for the next one when all's been set right, but I'm still in the darkness, awaiting the light. I know I should hope, but sometimes I'm just tired. Yes, I've been blessed just to breathe air at all. You're giving much more, and I'm grateful beyond all the words that escape me in the midst of this loss. Refine me as gold, but I feel like the dross. I don't know how this works, how your plan collides with pain, and my fear lives in those gaps. But there's one thing that I know: you sustain everything. You sustain everything. You sustain everything. You sustain everything. You sustain.
I think that's great, because you're right. Like the classic K-Love, I don't know, Christian radio thing is always like, life has problems, but Jesus is awesome, or you just say, or you're awesome, and I can do
Yeah,
anything. It's like,
yeah,
what? Why? Let me sit in my pain for a second.
yeah.
And yeah, let's talk about that other song through. Because I wanted to
Mm,
talk about that one. Because again, it's dealing with the idea of pain and suffering, but this one deals with it differently, like you said, and that it even begins to recognize that it's through suffering and pain that we actually, weirdly enough, are molded and shaped into the image of Jesus, because he also was like the man of sorrows.
yeah.
You say in there that your image formed through me, through each scar I bear like you. And I think that's just like a really interesting idea where you're like putting into words that concept of suffering as Christians, and how that, like, because Paul had kind of that idea too, where he was like, oh, when I'm in prison or being flogged or whatever, it's like that's when I'm really the most like Jesus, because I'm
Mm,
literally doing what Jesus did. And there's actually a point to it other than just like pain for pain's sake. And so for you, like in writing that and even putting those songs, because I think they're back to back on the album,
yeah,
because
they
I
are.
think that would probably be why, is you're like, here's this like questioning song, and then here's the answer. So for you, what inspired that song for you, and why do you think that that's like a sufficient answer personally to
Mm.
like maybe what that other song was going through in Upholder?
Yeah, so it's actually through is my other favorite song on the record. So the meantime and through are my two favorites. And I wrote through first before I wrote the meantime. But um, I actually have to give credit to my good friend and former colleague Josh Caspian, because he had said it would be cool if somebody wrote a song like about like how like like in the same way Jesus talks about the cup, like that every like cup is like has been passed through the Father's hands, and then something in there about like how there's like Jesus is like nail pierced hands, and that's like he's like it'd be cool like you should do something with that. And so I often like things like that, like little assignments, like projects, because it can lead to sometimes when you just have a blank canvas, it's weird to know where to go. But like when something like that happens, it kind of gives you a space to play in. And again, that one was one where I think I wrote a good chunk of the chorus with no music. I just like kind of wrote poetry and just put it together. And I was like, it was wordy. So I was like, I don't even know if this is going to sing. Um, but both Upholder and Through, like some of like I really like the way that they do sing, but they were like written without music at first, which is not the most common thing to write that much, like to have written like a whole section or full lines without music. And so I remember I sat down. I was just starting to try to write on other instruments. I normally write on guitar. That's my primary instrument. And I'm not a pianist, but I try to like sometimes writing on what's not your primary gets you into different thought patterns. And so I sat down at a piano to write that one. And um as I was like exploring it, I couldn't help but think that there's so much to be mined out of our relationship to Jesus in suffering. So like, I mean, Christians are so quick to shortcut what the answer is around, like, and we have really bad options oftentimes for causality. It's like, oh, this happened to you because this, and like really, I mean, there's God's answer to Job is you're in the fog and I'm not, like because Job actually never finds out what was going on.
No.
Um, and in Jesus, the answer is a person, and it's a person who suffers with us and in kind with us. But I can't help but think that his suffering like redeems ours and has purpose beyond just for its own sake. And so I wanted to explore that notion. I think I was thinking about this recently, the sense almost that like after the fall, like sin and death became like an invasive species in the creative order. It just started like replicating and growing, and God could have just like, taken like heaven grade hand sanitizer and just like killed it all and just been like, no, this is wiped out. And he's like, no, this is here now. I'm gonna co-opt it. And he kind of almost invaded it, um, and started using it, to his own ends. never causing it, but through the acts of endless causality of the fall and our nature, he weaves himself right into the midst of it and does stuff with it. And this idea that like I might not on this side of eternity see how my suffering in any given circumstance, what it was achieving, but I can trust that it has been repurposed in Jesus. And that's why I think like the last chorus of that song, where it flips on its head, is the most important thing I've ever written. I think that's the most, it might be the most important thing I ever write. Like it is, I think, my contribution to like theology. And I think there's like this beautiful, I think you approach suffering very differently when you approach it like with Jesus. Like he is in this with me. Not just like, you know, grieving because he did that, but like that his cosmic act has taken place even in the midst of what I'm experiencing.
I will desire safety, though my heart despises loss. My God stays me with peace, eclipsing every thorn and any cross. Though my will desire safety, though my heart despises loss, my God stays me with peace, eclipsing every thorn and any cross. Though my will desire safety, though my heart despises loss, my God stays me with peace, eclipsing every thorn and any cross. My hope in one alone, who has gone before in love. I know it in my bones by the promise of your blood, that this blessed cup of suffering went through the nail-pierced hands of Christ. Every wound he bore obediently repurposed each of mine. My battered hands an altar on which his sacrifice now lays. Every ounce of his affliction, the substance by which I'm remade.
Well, and I think that's interesting from a Christian perspective is like having a God who like is actually with you in your suffering and like weeps with you, because
Yes.
often gods, and even Christians do this, where they think of God like a Greek god or something, where he's off in this like distant land looking down. He's not really a part of what you're going through because he's too busy to care, and that's just not the God we have. And he's actually a God who suffers with us to the point of dying for us on a cross. Like it doesn't get more like
Yeah.
messy in your own life than that. And you're right too with Job. Like Job never gets an answer, which is so weird. And even when I read Job, I sit there and I'm still like, yeah, but why? Like I still have
Yeah.
so many questions. Why did any of this have to happen? And the whole point of that book is to be like, you're not gonna really get it, man.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out later. Where it's like this is so big that you just need to trust me in it. And it's like, okay, well, I don't have an answer, but it's helpful to know like there's something and God's doing something, and I can partner with him in this.
Well, I think too, before we move on, like with Job specifically, Job doesn't get an answer, but in that case, we actually do. And when people reduce it to just, oh, God and Satan made a bet, I don't know if you had Eric Ortland at Briarcrest or not, but his if you took Hebrew poetry and wisdom with him, he talks about basically the accuser, Satan, comes to Yahweh and says, Yahweh first approaches Satan actually and says, like, have you noticed my servant Job? He's awesome. And Satan goes, he doesn't love you for you. He loves you for your stuff. You've been Santa Claus to him, and if you take that away, he won't love you. And so the integrity of Job is on the line, but by extension, then the integrity of God is on the line because God has made a declaration about who Job is, and Satan is questioning and interrogating that. And so all of this is meant to prove the relationship that Job has with Yahweh and Yahweh has with Job. And we get to see that, but he doesn't. And that's what's important, is that like we can understand that there are probably ends being achieved, but that like his friends rush to explain what that is and shortchange it and shortcut it. And Christians do this all the time. Not just like they might not just be like, because like in the case of them, they're super accusatory of him and say like you've just done wrong stuff, like you've clearly messed up, and you just need to own it. But like Christians will so quickly jump to like oh, this happens, so this could happen, this could happen, so this could happen, and the point of Job not finding out is that we often don't, and we're not meant to. I can't remember if there was anything else I was going to say with that, but yeah, that was generally the point.
Yeah, well, and he Ortland actually, it was funny, I got an ESV commentary because they've been doing like a whole series, and I got the Job one and I looked at it and I was like, what? I was like, this is my professor from Briarcrest.
Yeah.
He wrote the commentary on Job, which I do find he's a super smart guy. His whole family is super smart. So it's like a bunch of super smart people all together writing all these awesome books, and you're like, wow, how is one family writing so many great books?
I remember something else I was going to say too, is that I think that like God's mechanism all the time is process, like, and slow process. And I personally, like, not everybody's this, I believe we see that all the way from the beginning of the created order, because I'm old earth, and so I believe that he formed over very intentionally, very much hands-on, but formed over, aeons of time. And I can't remember who said it, but like somebody who described him as like a 3 mile an hour God, and that's how he works so often. And I can't help but think, and this isn't the answer for all of these things, but I think a lot of the moral failing we've been seeing from high profile Christian leaders last few years have been people who were highly gifted and didn't have enough behind the scenes process. There wasn't enough waiting. There wasn't enough formation in the dark. There wasn't, and that doesn't explain everybody. There are situations where that's not the case, but I think a lot of times elevated gifting above character, because character I think can really only be formed slowly. Sure, we can be born with a certain amount of favor that like, makes us inclined towards more of the character of Jesus, but so much of that is formed through loss, through the meantime, through patience, through waiting. And some of that is on us. Some of that's like, like Israel had to wait for 40 years because they messed up royally. But that's not always the case. That's not why Abraham had to wait. That's not why Joseph had to wait. Those are instances where the right thing was just time that they didn't want to have to spend, but they did.
Well, and I think that's one of the largest struggles of Christians in the Western world is like we're in the instant now culture and like 2-day shipping, and you just can't Amazon Prime like spiritual formation.
Yeah.
And like your walk with God. But the thing is, we want to, and we don't. It's really hard because everything around you is pushing you to not allow there to be space or time. But I think you're right that a lot of Christian leaders, the reason why they fall, and not all of them, but is because if you're to look at their spiritual life and what it looked like behind the scenes, there was a lot of like, it wasn't super deep because they didn't allow the space and the time to be formed, even just the time and when they took on leadership. like even just that alone, where it's like they're like leading mega churches at 25. It's like that's probably not going to do well to like a 25-year-old brain to be like,
Yeah.
I'm awesome. It's not going to help you. That's going to be
Yeah.
hard. And we often, yeah, we struggle with the waiting and like slowing down to be with God because you just want to rush it.
Something I love of a fellow church. I'm good friends with a lot of leadership here in Vancouver called The Way, and their leadership, like their like pastoral staff, like that are like on staff paid, are in their 30s, but in like for years leading up to them launching, and now they're sitting directly under the leadership of a pastor named Daryl Johnson, who's in his 70s, who's been fast pastoring faithfully for, and man, talk about the meantime, like that guy's always had like robust ministry, but he is having opportunity in his 70s. He's speaking at conferences and getting to know like very famous Christians at like this point in his ministry. And it's beautiful because it's a lifetime of faithfulness and abiding, and it just gushes out of him. It's just he is one of the kindest, most wise, biblically sound, yet childlike and joyful people I've ever met. He is incredible. And I think they've done it the right way by following him, as like they're sitting under him intentionally and constantly going to him for wisdom, having him speak and honestly guide their congregation quite a bit. And I think there's so much wisdom in that.
Well, it's so funny you bring up Daryl because I thought about that last week where I was like, I think I was watching a sermon by him or something. And I was like, what a weird, like, I just wonder what it's like to be this guy where you like put in all this work for all these years. And like he was a professor of Regent. So it wasn't like he was like a nobody, but it was like
No,
nobody was reading his books really. Nobody was this, like if you said Daryl Johnson 10 years ago, nobody really knew, nobody would have known who you were talking about. And it's so weird now to be like he's in his 70s and it's like the dude's just blowing up, and it's with teaching that he's had the whole
yeah,
time. So
totally,
all they've done is taken books that were already written and just rebranded it, and they're just releasing like podcasts he did like in the 90s. And it's like this
totally.
is so good, and it's just so weird to see like the faithfulness of like an entire life, and then kind of like what we would see in like our culture, like, oh, this is the reward, which he would probably be like, no, because he even too, the weirdest part is he's got all this attention now and he's constantly like pushing it off, where he's like, I don't want it. He's like, I want to give it to the
Yeah,
next generation. And you're like, Daryl, come on,
totally.
just enjoy it for a second. But it's so cool to see something like that where it's like a life of faithfulness. And now he's just beginning to see like the work that he's done and like the harvest it's producing in people. And that's like super cool to just see and to have someone like that in the church. The last song I kind of want to talk about before we kind of move on from songs is the song Lepers, which
Mm,
is the title track. It also came out a long time. I'm so curious
yeah.
if that was written and you as like a single, then you're like, oh, I'm gonna like do this whole record like this. But it's also an interesting song because it like really blew up, and it's one of those songs that when you listen to, you're like, this isn't a song that like, because it's like super mellow and like
Yeah,
ambient, and it's just got like a certain vibe that you're like, if you were to pick a song out of like a selection of your songs and be like, this is the one that's gonna blow up, like this wouldn't be the one you would pick, not because it's bad, but because you're like, this isn't usually the typical song that just like
mhm,
everyone's like, I gotta listen to this. And so I find that really interesting where it's like, huh, that's so weird. Like it just like hit people in a different way where it's a really simple, like it's not super flashy, but it's very
yeah,
ambient and really cool. And it deals with just a call for people to just come to Jesus. And you say that, you're begging people like, come to the fountain, come take the blood, come drink the water, just come be healed by his love. And so I'm wondering for you, a couple different thoughts that you might lose and not all answer, which is fine. But what inspired that song? What made you right? What was it like watching that song? Because I don't know if for you were like, this is gonna be like a hit, or if you were like, this is gonna be a really cool single. I'm excited to push out, and you're like, oh, people really like it. All right. And then was this something you were planning on putting on a record, or was it some? Because it's like the title track of everything, and it's so like,
yeah.
oh, is it so far? Because I forget when it came out, but I looked at the date and I was like, yeah, like it was like long before the record came out,
Yeah,
and
it's
so
2019.
yeah, so lots of
Yeah,
questions, but what are
no,
your
it's
thoughts
good.
on all that?
Yeah. It's the second oldest song on the record, actually. It's Lazarus Heart I wrote is the oldest. Lazarus Heart I wrote when I was in Bible school. Yeah, I wrote it in a songwriting class in Bible school. And so, but Lepers is second oldest. It was actually written around the same time that most of the songs on Lion Lamb were written. And I debated putting it on that EP. Like I was trying to decide what to do with it. So basically what happened was in 2015 I graduated, or not, I finished an internship at a church in Alberta, and then I went to Green Bay Bible Camp in Kelowna, BC. And that was just a time where it was beautiful. I feel my calling was really affirmed. I realized, okay, I'm going to figure out how to release music, because I thought that was just kind of something that would happen one day, and realized like I actually wanted to pursue recording and getting my music into the world and trying. And then I went from that. I was trying to decide on what kind of opportunity to follow after that camp summer, and basically spent 6 months in Saskatoon, in my parents' basement, in a room where there was no, like, it was like just a weird time where my normal room wasn't available. And so I was just staying in this like provisional space with no windows. And I was like, honestly, pretty depressed and just trying to decide what to do with my life, and wrote a lot of music in that time. And Lepers was one of those songs. And so I'd written, yeah, a lot that came out on Lion Lamb. I had written Lepers, and didn't know what was going to be on the record, and ultimately decided like these are the songs that need to be on the album, and knew that. And so just sat with Lepers knowing what I when I wrote it, I was like, I know I want this to have that vocoder effect on it. I knew that was like integral to what the song was. I was leading it a little bit in my church in Kelowna once I ended up in Kelowna, but obviously without that, just kind of as like a worship band song. And then I had told a buddy that I was, well, I guess in the writing process, I wrote it then, and it falls into the category of I wanted to write a worship song I hadn't heard before. And I think two things that are really drawn to me in terms of lyricism are, one is, yeah, exploring like the nature of suffering with the nature of God, and then also just the overlooked and the downtrodden and that sort of thing. And that's also going to be my first single from the biblical epic, will be coming out sometime this year, and that one hits a lot of that kind of same thematic space, just from a very different way. And so I want to write something of that nature, and most of the time when I'm writing something like that, in some way I'm identifying with it. And I think at that point, just being tired and in the middle of space of waiting and that sort of thing, it just came pretty naturally. And then so I had a friend in Kelowna who is a talented musician. He was starting to produce a little bit, and he was like, he had heard my idea for the vocoding idea, and he's like, hey, why don't we just like try that? And so like in his basement, we were just going to record a demo, and that's what it was going to be. It was just going to be a demo. And so we did it, and I was like really liking how it came together, and I thought, you know what, like I might actually just release this. And I was like, I had no money. I was super broke, and I just basically said to DeBo, I was like, I can't really pay you what it deserves. I mean, we just did it as friends anyways, but I was like, I could put you on as like a feature, like with one of his projects. And he said, sure. And then I released it. And as that happened, it was a time when Spotify was just releasing this ability to like directly submit your songs to playlist curators, like on the editorial team. And so I did that, and it just got picked up. It got picked up by like, this has been in 2019 that I released it, and it just got picked up by a handful of big playlists, like really big ones, and then just started taking off. And it was like, oh, okay, wow. And it's like crazy, because I remember when it hit like, like 500,000 streams, and how insane that felt. And then like, I mean, now I'm in like, within a few months it'll be at 3. And it's just, I don't even know how that happened. It's crazy. But like, yeah, it's like, that's like how people have like know me a lot of the time, is like the people like know that song. Like, so like there have literally been girls who've commented on, my wife Caitlin is a abstract painter. She's incredible. She has a massive Instagram following. And when we got engaged, like literally people were like commenting on it saying, "You're marrying the guy who wrote Lepers?" And
The
like
Lepers guy?
they know both of us separately somehow.
It's so funny.
And yeah, and then what ended up happening was that as that took off and I decided, okay, I'm going to not try to toe the congregational line. I'll allow myself to kind of more take the singer-songwriter vein, still very faith-based, and then like I'll write for whatever church I'm in congregationally. That kind of song in a lot of ways became the rubric of, okay, this is like my approach in a lot of ways sonically. Of kind of this mix of like ambient electronica, lo-fi with like organic instruments. So that'll be a theme you'll notice a lot on the record is you get acoustic guitar and acoustic percussion mixed with very synthetic keys, like very processed electric, that kind of thing. And that's kind of been my sweet spot. And I feel like that's like the space I love now. Like that's where I like to live. And so more and more exploring that. I think I was a little bit more eclectic sonically early on. And part of me always had, I mean, like even though the new record, like Wounded Heart, is pretty much mostly just straight up pop punk. But I think that more and more I'm trying to hone in on that sound. And Lepers really in a lot of ways set the tone of that, literally.
Come to the fountain. Come take the blood. Come drink the water. Just come and be healed by his love. 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 Come to the fountain. Come take the blood. Come drink the water. Just come and be healed by his love. All ye lepers, broken hearted, come to the one who won't look away. All ye slain men in your grave clothes, he makes dead things live again.
Yeah, that's funny. It's super interesting. Well, it's interesting too to think that there was a song that you held on to for a long time and you're like, I'll just release it. And then the world was like, yep, that's great.
Yeah, it's crazy. I don't know what happened there.
I think I'll ask you two more questions. One,
Sure.
this whole, because I remember when you were on last, you were just about to start crowdfunding for this album.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to know, like, from your perspective, what was that experience like? Because I remember pretty quickly, like, it was like fully funded. And so for you to like sit there and be like, I'm going to try to crowdfund and I'm going to crowdfund a whole album and to like go through that process. What was that like for you to like put it out there? Because then I imagine too that to like ask people to help financially with an album is like spooky because you're like, what if it fails? Like, what if like, and even though you're like, it probably won't, but you're still, there's like that side of you that's like, what if I put this out there and the like everybody just tells me we don't want you to make music anymore, Joshua? Like, so what was it like for you to like crowdfund an album and then have it like a ton of people just like back it and be super pumped about it?
It's wild. It was my second crowdfund. The first one was like the craziest move of God I had experienced to that point, I think, in terms of the first one. Really in the sense that the first one, like, I got funded having never put anything out, which was amazing, and that people continued to give to it after it already had gotten funded, so I ended way past my goal. But like, it was more just like the response of like we recorded an acoustic version of Steadfast for that, and like just a video sharing my heart about the the project. That was for the EP in 2017, and just the response that people had to just that song was so beyond what I could comprehend. And I had gone through the very real feeling of what if it fails then, but then had that again with the new one because the number was so much higher. But I can't remember if I shared this in the last one or not, but like I remember the moment of panic of realizing like this could fail with the first one. And my friend asked me if I had given it to Jesus truly, and I said yes. And he said, if it's failed, like if it fails, have you given it to him? And I said yes. And he said, if he's in it, I don't think there's too much you can do to screw it up. And if he's not, I don't think there's too much you can do to make it happen. And I loved that. And sure enough, it worked out. And then so the second time I was like, okay, I know there are people who are met in this stuff. They've told me they want to support me, but it's a big number. It's $30,000. That's no joke. And so and at this point now I have a manager. He's a good friend of mine, and he's very business savvy. I'm not. So it was much easier doing a crowdfund with somebody else who's, got this stuff. And I was way better prepared this time. Like, we made the video in the first crowdfunder, like in 2017. I made the video like halfway through. And like I had basically I had the album art and like my heart on paper, and that was all I had for the first one. And then that once the video came out, so this time was much more organized and in better shape. And so we had a video ready to go and all of our kind of plan of attack and how we were going to promote it and all that stuff. But again, still astronomical number. And it's like, okay, this is like, it still puts you in a place where that like just having your ducks in a row is not enough. Like, you have to trust Jesus with it. And especially like the landscape has changed so much. I feel like crowdfunding music was very popular, like in the 5-ish years ago range. And now like it's not as, you don't see it as much. And so I didn't know how the landscape would be. And I remember telling John like, how amazing it would be if we could get like 10% on the first day, like $3,000. And he says like one of his main jobs as a manager is to manage expectations. He's like, that would be great, but like, let's keep it like chill. And I don't remember what we closed out at day one on, but like within like 48 hours, it was like 50% there, I think, already. Like, it was insane. It was we were well past 10 grand on the first day. And I don't really have words for that. Like, and to your question too about like, doesn't that feel like sheepish to like ask people? Yes, absolutely. I had to get past that part of myself because it is very hard to like do that. And yet I think for me, it's become this thing where I so believe in these songs that that was actually something else too. I remember in the first, because I'm hesitant to say like when I hear the voice of God in terms of just not wanting to like ascribe to him things that are me. But I remember when I did the first one, like telling God, like, because it was something like I was like, I feel like you give me a lot of what I want, but like the things I want most, you don't. And I'm afraid that this is going to happen. This won't happen because of that. And I felt very much like he lovingly slapped me across the face and said, like, this is not about you. I have work to do and you get to be a part of it, but that's not you're not the point. And that takes all the pressure off. Like, I came to a place where I felt like this is not about me succeeding. This is about music that I believe in helping people. And I have a friend who we like in the process of this new record getting funded, we FaceTimed, and he said, I think Josh, like, I think your songwriting is amazing. I think you're an amazing musician, but I think people see this as more than music. I think they see it as like ministry. So they're like funding you on that level too. And it's been wild. Like, it's hard to comprehend that. But it's beautiful, and I don't feel like I can let any of it go to my head because it's just so outside of me. It's not something that I can claim any kind of credit for, and so it is surreal. but I'm just very grateful.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And I agree. I think a lot of people like your music, and it's because it ministers to them and it ministers to other people. And it's not just like, as much as it'd be great to be like, yeah, we just like Joshua, but I think it's more than that. Like, I think like it has a larger reach and impact than just Joshua makes good music. I like, it's like, yeah, this ministers to like my soul, other people's souls. And so we want to support that. And so lastly for you, because you've kind of hinted at it, I just want to ask you, are you making more music? And do you have an idea of when that might happen and become a real thing?
Yeah. So I think, it is, no matter what, it's always harder for me because I'm not full time with music. I work full time
Yep.
at a church and then I do this on the
Mm-hmm.
side. But when I was at my last church, which was a very large church, and I was trying to get worship ministry, like original music, off the ground with them, I kind of put my own stuff on hold for a while. I'd been
Mm-hmm.
writing and I had like a catalog built up, but just like wasn't actively pursuing it. And now I'm like trying to prioritize still putting out music as
Yeah.
myself in the midst of doing ministry. So that makes it a lot easier. So yes, more music is coming. 2 singles will be coming this year.
Oh,
And then the hope is over the next few years to tackle this pretty massive endeavor. So right after Easter, my producer is coming from Pender Island, and my 2 good buddies who also like kind of both co-produced and played instruments on the last record, like we kind of all were together in a room. So they're literally coming to my house and we're just going to record there. And so one song is a single that's going to be for later on this biblical concept record. And the other one's an Advent song, actually. And so plan is to release those both this year. And then, I've talked about it a lot conversationally. I don't know how much I've said publicly about it yet, but the biblical concept record I'm doing is basically just Genesis to Revelation.
Wow, that's awesome.
And it's kind of it hones in and gets super focused on certain things, and then very big picture on other things. So like condensing parts of the story of Israel into very like what's the kind of the general thrust of the whole prophets, like kind of made personal, but it's very gritty. It's very like point of view, trying to get you inside the minds and hearts of figures. And so, yeah, I'm very excited about it. Originally the plan was to just do one like 25 song record. But now the plan is to do a series of EPs that will then culminate in one record. And
that's awesome. That's cool.
Fun ideas about like how that will be outworked practically in terms of even the experience of it.
Yeah.
But so that's going to keep me busy for a while. And so I've written not quite 50% of it yet, but quite a bit. And I'm working on it pretty regularly. I've tackled what I think is going to be the hardest one already. So now it's a little bit smoother sailing from there, hopefully.
There you go. Man, that's awesome. That's super cool. That gets me really pumped, where I'm looking forward to that pretty deeply now. So I look forward to hearing more. Joshua, thanks again for hopping on here. This has been great. I love chatting with you, being able to pick your brain. If people want to follow you or support you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so you can follow me on pretty much everything. On Instagram, I'm just Joshua Leventhal. I have a music page on Facebook, Joshua Leventhal. I have Twitter, but I don't even know what my handle is. It's like John's gonna hate me saying that, but I'm the worst with Twitter. And then like I'm on all streaming platforms, so Spotify, if that's your gig, Apple Music. I'm very grateful to Spotify. They've been my biggest pusher, but I personally use Apple Music for listening primarily. And then YouTube, I'm trying to like work on beefing up my YouTube a bit more. And but like literally on everything. Best way to support is just to follow along, stream the songs. More merch will be coming out soon. Buy that, and there'll be lots of opportunities. Hopefully, I'll be getting back into shows in the near future. And looking forward to that.
Oh man, Joshua, awesome! Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, dude.